On today's episode of the podcast, we've got Shane Harvey and Prashant Mital. These guys work in the MongoDB Drivers team, and they are solely responsible for maintaining the Python drivers. I'm talking about PyMongo, PyMODM, and Motor. If you're a Python developer and you want to interface with MongoDB, today's the episode for you. We're going to talk about feature maintenance, how features get into these drivers, and the process of maintaining the roadmap for the drivers. These guys are super bright. Great to talk to. I hope you enjoy the episode. Before we jump in there, a bit of a favor to ask. Hey, if you wouldn't mind, would you head on over to your favorite podcast network like Apple or Spotify? Leave us a review. Let us know what you like about the podcast and maybe even what you'd like to hear in the podcast. What do you want to hear more of? Who do you want us to talk to? Greatly appreciate it. Enjoy the show.
The only constant in software is change.
Software, data, and all things MongoDB. Welcome to the MongoDB podcast with your hosts, Michael Lin and Nick Raboy.
Prashant, Shane, how's it going? Thanks for being on this podcast today. Do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself before we jump right into the core material of Python and the MongoDB driver for Python?
Hey, Nick. Thanks for having us. So my name is Prashant. I've been with the company for 2.5 years. And my background is actually in engineering, like mechanical engineering, and then bioinformatics. And I come as an enthusiastic disciple of data science to build databases at MongoDB. I'm loving it so far.
Awesome.
Hi, Nick. My name's Shane. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having us. I've worked at MongoDB for the last 4 years, and about 3.5 of that has been on the Python team at MongoDB. Before MongoDB, I came straight from college out of Stony Brook University, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Now, this is probably our largest podcast episode as far as participants. Where is everyone located? Are we all in the same place? How about you, Prashant?
So I'm in San Francisco, not too far from where we used to, go work before the coronavirus hit.
Yeah, Prashant and I are both in San Francisco. I just moved here about almost a year ago now.
So that we're all in California except for Mike then, right? Or are you in California today?
No, not today. I'm still just outside of Philadelphia. Great to have you guys on the podcast.
Awesome. So why don't we start jumping right into it? So MongoDB has quite a few drivers when it comes to what you can use to develop with. Before we jump into the actual Python driver, do either of you want to maybe go over what drivers are available and things like that?
And hey, what is a driver?
Yeah, that works too.
So a driver is essentially, think of it as a connector. It's what connects your application to the database. And the reason that a driver is so important, heck, we have jobs because, drivers exist. And the reason you need a dedicated team to build a driver is because a lot of the smart stuff that MongoDB can do, it can do because the drivers are smart. And that's why it needs a large concerted engineering effort to build. But for the user, I guess it suffices to say that it's the piece of code that you import into your app to be able to talk to the database, issue queries, and run other operations on the DB.
So when I started at MongoDB, I kept saying SDK, and a lot of people were saying driver. Is there a particular reason why we're calling it a driver, not an SDK?
I think it's just a difference in terminology. You can think of it as an SDK, and we often use some of these phrases ourselves. Like we just call it the library, or like the client library, or the driver, or the SDK. I think all of those phrases are all applicable.
And when I started working with MongoDB, one of the most frustrating aspects of developing, because I am, I guess, a polyglot, like like Nick's work, I work in multiple languages. And one of the most frustrating things about MongoDB was that from one language to the next, there was vast differences in the interaction, in the interface. I hope maybe we can touch on how that's gotten better, and was there a concerted effort to minimize the differences going from language to language?
Yes, Mike. So MongoDB started around 10 years ago, and about 5 years ago, the drivers team as a whole started a process to help all of our language APIs kind of converge and become unified across the different languages. And we refer to that as our specifications. And these are a set of open source um, guidelines for how to develop an API for MongoDB in a particular language.
Great. Yeah. So now if I don't know if there's a new language that becomes available, and I want to write an API, I want to write a driver to help developers use MongoDB with that language, I've got a place to go. Where do I get more information on that spec?
So that those set of specs live in GitHub. It's called github.com/mongodb/specifications, and you can look at all of the open specs about the CRUD API for querying and writing data to MongoDB, or API or specifications for more internal driver behavior like server discovery and monitoring, and things like that.
Now, when it comes to the release of these drivers, and I realize that the two of you specialize more in Python than anything else. Um, do you does MongoDB try to be consistent on when new features are added to the driver? So if a new feature comes out, is it going to be available in all drivers at the same time, or will it slowly roll out through the drivers?
I think we make our best effort at ensuring that features are rolled out across the driver ecosystem at the same time as far as possible. So a good example of this is actually the ACID transactions feature, the multi-document transactions feature that was added in MongoDB 4.0. And that feature actually rolled across the whole driver ecosystem all at once. But it's obviously not always possible to have a very coordinated engineering effort and do this with every feature release. And of course, there are some features which actually only make sense in specific languages. So while we do try to build our drivers to a specification, as Shane just mentioned, so that we have a standard set of capabilities in each language, we also want the drivers to feel idiomatic, right? You don't want to be dealing with a Python driver and have it feel like a C++ driver, for instance. So you want to preserve all the features of a language that made you gravitate towards that language in the first place. And what that ultimately means is that there's kind of this constant tension between adhering to a very rigid or a very precise specification, and also remaining idiomatic in the sense that the language community kind of embraces your driver and uses it throughout. And so that tension always plays into whether or not we are able to, or it always plays into the timeline upon which we are able to roll features out into the production drivers.
I love the thoughtfulness behind that. Um, Maintaining the idiomatic nature so that a Python developer can interact with MongoDB and still feel like it's Python, like it's Pythonic. That's awesome. And I know that's true across all of the language space. Now, so let's double click on the Python space. And now that we're talking, we've talked about what drivers are. We've talked about the specifications that you align your driver development to. Let's get into Python specifically. Now, I know there are several ways that Python developers can interact with MongoDB. There's PyMongo, there's Motor, and there's PyMODM. Can one of you give me a brief explanation of each of those, and maybe let's talk about why one over the other for specific use cases?
Yeah, for sure. So the way I like to think about all of our different projects in the Python ecosystem, I kind of think of PyMongo as the fundamental building block. PyMongo is the one driver to rule them all when it comes to Python and MongoDB. And really, PyMongo is the driver which implements the specification that we've been talking so much about. And if you want the latest and greatest way of interacting with MongoDB via Python, no questions asked, you need to go and install PyMongo. That's where features land the first. It's got the largest user community out of any of our drivers. Almost 6 million downloads per month, which is actually more than Django. So that tells you a couple of things. One, that we have a very large user base, and the other is that people aren't necessarily just using PyMongo as PyMongo. Every PyMODM download and every motor download will also generate a PyMongo download because it's a dependency. To answer your second question, which is a bit more nuanced as to how to select between various drivers, I think a lot of that has to be motivated by the use case. So when it comes to PyMongo, I think it's the most general purpose driver. So you could use it in your web app, which you're using, Flask or Pyramid or Django to write. You could also use it just as a command line tool to interact with MongoDB, run administrative commands, create indices, run ad hoc queries. So PyMongo is great at facilitating all those kinds of use cases and workloads. And then when you think about Motor, Motor essentially provides you the same set of capabilities, but it uses Python's async await framework. And so, or rather, it supports Python's async await framework. And so if you're writing a web app that uses Tornado, and you love Python async, but you still want to use MongoDB, then your best bet is to go ahead and use Motor. And one of the beautiful things about the way the Motor project is organized, and I invite listeners to go to our GitHub and check out the source code for the driver and the documentation, so on and so forth. The great thing is that we basically wrap PyMongo in an async framework. So most features which land in PyMongo, we get for free in Motor. And we have done such a good job of doing this that we're even able to reuse much of PyMongo's test suite to test Motor. So it's really kind of a cool exercise just for a general Python developer, even if you don't use MongoDB. And then the final project that you mentioned, PyMODM, that's a project which is great if you come from the world of relational databases and you know what a ORM is. You've used something like SQL Alchemy, and that's how you're used to building applications on top of a database, where you define a class that implicitly defines your data model. And so you can do the same thing with MongoDB as long as you use PyMODM or any of the other ODMs, object document models, that exist in other languages.
So when you talked about all three of these Python technologies for MongoDB, you threw out a lot of web development related stuff. So to get the kind of creative juices flowing, let's say that I am an IoT developer. Python nowadays has a huge influence on IoT. If you were to throw one of these technologies out, which one do you think would be the most common when it comes to, say, Raspberry Pi or one of these other IoT popular technologies?
Shane, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I probably would expect PyMongo to be used. PyMODM is more about like a web app kind of use case, whereas PyMODM gives you like the full functionality of interacting with MongoDB, and same for Motor. So I think it really depends on what kind of framework we're using. If you're running async IO on your IoT device and using MongoDB, you're going to want to use Motor. And if you're using just a synchronous standard Python, you're going to use PyMongo.
So it kind of sounds like it's maybe just a preference kind of thing. And I'm sorry if that was a silly question because I'm not embedded deeply in the Python ecosystem. But would you agree that it's just whatever your preference is? If you like the async stuff, then go with Motor or use one of the other options.
Yeah, it also depends on like where this is running, because PyMODM,
Sure.
These APIs are for connecting directly to the database itself. So if you have like a app architecture where all of your IoT devices connect directly to your database and are sending data real time in that way, sure, you can definitely use PyMongo or Motor. It kind of depends on your app architecture.
Maybe another consideration that one has in mind when choosing something for a application such as this, like an IoT system, is the hardware itself, right? Like I'm running this on a Raspberry Pi, like you mentioned. And so on that perspective, actually, we have full flexibility with the Python drivers. PyMongo, while it does have a C library component, it can operate without that. So, if you're on a system where you can't compile our C libraries, though I would imagine that's very rare, you can actually use a pure Python version. You'll get a pure Python version of PyMongo, and that'll run anywhere you can stand up the Python interpreter. So you have full freedom in terms of which platform you can really host your app on.
So did I hear that correctly? That Motor and PyModem both have a C library dependency, whereas PyMongo does not. Did I understand that correctly?
Not exactly. So
All right, sorry.
no, that's okay. It's kind of convoluted. So PyModem and Motor both depend on PyMongo,
Got it.
and PyMongo has a optional C library dependency. So if it detects that it's on a system for which it is able to build those C libraries, they will be built or they will be installed as part of the pip install process, which is pip is Python standard package manager. Um, but if it detects that it's on a system where for which it does not have the compiled components available, it reverts back, it falls back to Python only code paths, which replicate the exact same functionality, maybe with some loss of performance.
It sounds like a hairy makefile. So we've talked about Motor, PyMongo, and PyModem, which are all maintained internally within MongoDB.
Yes,
Is that
that's
correct?
true.
Yeah.
So
And
Prashant and I maintain all three.
so that's pretty impressive to me. I mean, if we just talk about the numbers, there's something like 6 million downloads per month of PyMongo alone. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct, Mike.
That's pretty amazing. And then for Motor, it's about 160,000 downloads per month, and then for PyModem, it's about 35,000 downloads per month. So all of this maintained by a fairly small team. Is there anyone else, perhaps in MongoDB or from the community, that is assisting in development of these tools?
Yeah, so we do accept open source pull requests and contributions for all of these projects through GitHub, um, and we do have a number of engineers here at MongoDB who have worked on or still contribute to the Python drivers themselves. So Bernie Hackett, for example, has worked at MongoDB for around 8 years, and almost all of that on the Python driver. And he contributes to this as well.
And then, so these are three probably the most popular ways for developers to interact with MongoDB using Python. Are there other libraries or tools outside of these that deserve any kind of mention? Maybe other community drivers or
Yeah, so uh, there are several projects that have existed just because of how popular MongoDB was and still continues to be. There are several community projects which aren't built by engineers employed by MongoDB that still are, out there, and some of them are thriving actually. One that I can think of is Mongo Engine, and that's a very similar project to what PyModem does. So it's an ODM, an object document mapper, and it allows you to directly materialize documents in the database as classes in your code. So it's really quite cool. And to kind of rewind and maybe add a little bit to the points that we were making previously. So PyModem, PyMongo, Motor, these are all what we call official drivers. What that means is that we control, like we being MongoDB, the drivers team at MongoDB, we control their development, and most of the engineers who work on these projects are probably employed by us. And I guess the natural question is, why should anyone care about whether a driver is official or not? And there's actually a few compelling reasons to choose a official driver over an unofficial one. The first and foremost reason is that our official drivers conform to specifications that we publish. So we don't really merge any code that doesn't violates those specifications. And the other facet is the fact that you can actually buy commercial support if your application uses one of our official drivers, right? So if you have a mission critical workload that uses PyMongo, for instance, you can actually get some sort of an SLA on when you can expect support by if something starts failing, which is not necessarily the case if you go out and implement something using Mongo Engine, because then you might be just waiting on help on a GitHub issue, which isn't coming, right? So those are a couple of the big reasons, the headline reasons to choose a official driver.
That's a pretty compelling reason, especially if you're a large-scale enterprise and want to implement any kind of software built on Python. So that's good to know. And I'm always curious about the roadmap and how you go about selecting the features that you begin to work on. Let's kind of like get into the process of feature set selection and what it's like to get a feature from idea through implementation. What does that process look like for the Python team at MongoDB?
There are really two types of features that we implement in the Python driver. One of them is really driven by the core database itself. So the server will implement support for a new feature, and all of the language teams will need to implement that feature and expose it to developers, to app developers in our libraries. An example of that would be transactions. For example, in 4.0, MongoDB exposed ACID transactions, and all of the drivers had to add client-side APIs to be able to use that feature in your language. And the way this type of feature works, it's really driven by the product team here at MongoDB. So the product team identifies use cases for our customers that are very in demand, really wanted use cases, and they'll work with developers and engineers here at MongoDB, both on the server team and driver team. So for example, I worked on designing the transaction API for the client-side libraries. So I wrote the transaction specification, working with the product team and the server engineers who are also building this feature. The second type of feature that we build is driven by our users specific to Python itself. A great example of this is something that Prashant worked on a year or so ago, which was to add custom type encoding into our Beastson library so that you can define your, it basically gives you the ability to encode, say, any type of data you want into MongoDB through PyMongo without manually wrapping that data in some other class. And maybe Prashant can give you a better idea about how that process works.
Yeah, so for this second class of feature, really, that Shane's mentioned and mentioned briefly here, the way it usually starts out life is as a bunch of feature requests or as a bunch of comments on Jira tickets that tell us about a particular pain point that users have, but that is also language specific. So in Python, people are very used to not having to deal with the constraints of types. If it looks like a duck, we have duck typing, so everyone's very happy to not have to deal with strict typing. And unfortunately, when you think about serializing data into MongoDB, that doesn't always work for us because Beastson obviously deals in a finite number of specific types. And this feature that we had, this feature that I worked on, essentially what it allows you to do is define a way to convert a custom type that you have in your application code into a document or a different Beastson type that can be written directly to MongoDB without you needing to manually transform every document that's going over the wire. And so it makes that experience for you seamless. And that's really, the common thread between all the features that we do that are language specific. Usually all of them solve a developer pain point. They improve the developer experience while using the driver. And oftentimes they are language specific. So we don't necessarily come up with a cross driver specification for this. It's just something that we would do in Python piecemeal and then move on to the next thing.
So I have a question less specific around this client level feature, but you mentioned the types client level feature just now. Uh, how does that differ from the ODM functionality? Do they do the same thing? I mean, it's been a while since I've used an ODM, but it sounds like they might overlap. No?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. And they do overlap in a subset of ways. The custom type feature that's built into PyMongo itself, it doesn't give you all of the capabilities that an ODM would give you. For example, you're not able to define your schema through this API in PyMongo, but you are able to, say, automatically encode NumPy integers if those happen to be built into your app. And the ODM really also gives you the ability to use a query language on top of those classes that you define. So that's the second piece of an ODM that isn't part of PyMongo. PyMongo gives you the raw MongoDB API for querying.
You guys mentioned quite a bit there, Beastson, and I just want to clear that up just in case anybody's listening and is not aware of that. Do either one of you want to take that, or you want me to take that? But what is Beastson?
Beastson is our binary, is the serialization format that our documents are stored in. So in MongoDB, you can kind of think of it like a JSON document. But what we're actually working with is a binary version of that JSON. And we've called that Beastson for binary JSON. And this binary format supports more data types than standard JSON. So standard JSON has strings, numbers, not even integers, just like doubles, and arrays and nested documents and things like that. And in Beastson, we've added like datetime types,
Decimal
types, so like decimal 128. We've added like integer types for 64-bit or 32-bit integers, and so we've extended JSON to support these types.
Yeah, and I always like to explain to people that are new to MongoDB. Most developers understand the concept of objects, right? And JSON. That's like you. That's how you describe data, right? It's key value pairs. But the limitations you talked about of JSON make it almost necessary to have some other format, some other way to store that data, so that you alleviate the concern on the developer's part to have to figure out what the data type is. And you can't do that you can't describe something as a date in JSON. You can in Beastson. So you take a couple of extra bytes when you write that to disk, and you store that type, and it's virtually invisible. When you pull the data out of MongoDB, you don't see any of that Beastson data, but your driver does. Your driver gets to see that this is a date, and that means that from the developer's perspective, why this is important, why the developer would care, is that I don't know if you've done this, but I certainly have. I've written software where I had to store a date on disk, and I didn't have the benefit of Beastson, and I had to figure out whether the date was stored with the year up front or the year at the end, and what if there was a leap year, and do the conversions of date. None of that stuff is necessary when you leverage MongoDB and Beastson. So appreciate the explanation there. Yeah. So what's coming down the pike for the roadmap for Python, and what are you guys working on for the future?
Yeah. Definitely, Mike. Right now in the Python world, we're hard at work chugging away on the MongoDB 4.4 release that is going to be coming out soon. And for PyMongo, that means our 3.11 release. And this has a ton of cool features. If I could just go down the list, where we've added support for a new TLS implementation. So we use PyOpenSSL as an option instead of using the standard SSL module. And what that gives us is online certificate status protocol feature that allows you to do it's sort of a security feature that allows you to check revoked certificates on your connections. Sort of enhances security transparently. We've got MongoDB AWS authentication, so you can natively use your AWS credentials for authenticating to the database
Wow.
itself.
So hold up. This is a biggie. So you're telling me that is that just in Atlas? Is that just for Atlas, or is that for MongoDB server standalone?
That is, I believe, in the standalone server, not just in Atlas.
Okay, great. That's
And
terrific.
and the credentials that we're talking about is the AWS Identity Access Management credentials, so not the actual AWS account credentials themselves.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, gotcha.
So what this feature lets you do is it lets you remove the configuration of credentials in your app, and if your app is running on a particular AWS instance that you've set up correctly, it can automatically obtain the credentials to authenticate with the database.
Great. What else you
Um,
got cooking?
some other interesting features we have. Enhanced transactions, so you can now create collections in your transactions, which was a pain point on the previous release.
I believe you can also do transactions. You can have cross-shard transactions now, which isn't strictly speaking something we are doing with the driver, but still worth mentioning.
Yes, so that was added in MongoDB 4.2 for
Mm-hmm.
cross-shard transactions.
And that's when you say shard, that's a partition in the database, right? For horizontal scalability.
Right. So
Right.
if your data gets very large, you might want to split it up among machines, and our concept for that is sharding.
Awesome.
Is this something that the developer has to maintain through the Python driver, or is it through the just behind the scenes?
Um, the sharded transaction feature itself,
Yeah.
yeah, that it required some work in the driver. The API for the application is exactly the same. If you're using a sharded cluster or a replica set, it makes no difference in the application code. But it does require some extra mangling in the driver.
Sure.
Yeah, a couple other interesting features in the next release is improved connection performance. So connection establishment, we've optimized that in a number of ways to reduce the number of round trips we need to make with the database in order to create a new connection. So this is about reducing your latency for your operations
Mm-hmm.
in the application. And another cool feature is we've reduced the time the driver needs when responding to server events like a primary failover or a database upgrade, for example. Your application will automatically retry, and we've optimized that retry period um, to be optimistically only a few milliseconds. So, like, it used to be the case that at most, at the quickest we could retry was 500 milliseconds, and now we can retry in like tens of milliseconds.
So realistically, that means that failover operations can happen much quicker.
Yeah, so in terms of what this means for your application, it means if you're using the newest driver and the newest server, you might notice fewer latency spikes, like for those operations when maintenance is going on. So you'll see a more consistent operation latency in your app.
Ultimately, our objective is to have all this like melt into the background, and so you don't have to really think about whether failover is happening and whether you need to manage for latency spikes, for instance, in this case, right? So you just want to write some code that you know is going to run in a highly resilient way once your app is deployed. And this project has helped us kind of move the ball forward on that.
This was fantastic, everyone. So, I mean, while we try to wrap this up, is there anything that you think that we might have missed on this particular episode? Something that you're really dying to tell the listeners about what you guys are up to when it comes to Python, MongoDB, or just anything in general?
Please use Python 3. Stop using Python 2. It's EOL.
For some time now, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do the drivers support 2 at all, or is it completely cut out?
So yeah, some of our libraries support. So for PyMongo, for example, supports Python 2.7.
Sure.
And we do that because a number of our operating systems that we support within the company itself, they ship Python 2.7 as the default Python interpreter. And
I think my Mac does that, right?
right. And
Still.
we could take the stance that, we could just drop support for that Python version and require you to install a new Python for your application. But that really brings a pain point into using the driver itself. And we want to have a smooth transition so that people can use the latest driver, even if they're using an old version of Python. But ideally, once the number of users gets lower and lower, we can reconsider dropping support for Python 2.7. I believe at the beginning of the year, Python 3 versus Python 2 was about 50%, 50-50. And it's actually improved quite a bit. And Python 2 has dropped to around 30% in the last 6 months. So it's quite a steep drop. So I think developers and applications are really migrating off 2.7 pretty swiftly.
Hey, before we wrap, where's the best place that you can send a developer that's listening to this podcast and says, geez, I want to mess around with PyMongo. I want to learn about MongoDB and Python. What would you tell them to do? Would it be pip? Where would you send them?
I think we have great docs, so that's where I would send them. And you can find those docs at pymongo.readthedocs.io. That's a great place to start. And we also have an amazing user base that's highly active on our community forums. So that's community.mongodb.com/forums. And you can find the Python driver tag. If you have questions, you can post in there. You can see what doubts other users had. There's a lot of people who are just starting out with MongoDB who post on there. So chances are, in addition to Stack Overflow, our community forums are going to be a good friend if you're starting out with this technology.
So I have like $1 million question here for you guys. So since you're both using Python, you're both using Mongo, what are you using? Are you using PyMongo? You using PyMODM? What's your preference? Personal preference if you were developing applications?
Personal preference. I think I would use Motor or PyMongo, just because of how familiar I am with the MongoDB API, just from working with it over the years. Yeah, and I haven't built a MongoDB application in quite a while, so or maybe we can cut that part.
Fair enough.
Ding.
How about you, Prashant?
No, I love it.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with Shane. I would definitely go for PyMongo just because it's so powerful and flexible. And chances are, being as involved as I am and like seeing all the latest, greatest stuff that comes out of the MongoDB engineering department, I want to be able to use that stuff. And in order to do that, the choice is clear. You have to use PyMongo for the latest and greatest stuff.
Awesome. Mike, did we miss anything?
I think we're good. I would ask one more question, and it goes back to what Shane just mentioned. But how do you stay close to the developers? Obviously you've got a full plate, both of you. Your plates are full. You've got a lot of features that you're working on implementing. It's a constantly changing world. The changes coming from the server space, changes coming from the language space. How do you stay close and really empathize with the developers that are using your products?
I think for me, a lot of it, or at least, I mean, I don't know if it works really well, right? I don't have a great way of getting any signal on that. But the way I like to stay connected with what users think is by monitoring our community forums. Up until a short while ago, PyMODM used to have a Gitter channel, which was pretty active. Listening to what users have to say, what kind of questions they have on all these various channels is very, very useful for me as a developer, because it tells us where maybe our technology is deficient or maybe where our documentation is deficient. And I think in a general sense, I'm always thinking about whenever I get when I hear about a use case, which is just a general application use case, maybe it has nothing to do with Python. I always try to think about, hey, can we do this with PyMongo and MongoDB, right? Trying to figure out if the technology stack that I build on a daily basis can facilitate various use cases that I might come across in the wild. I feel like that's a great way to keep my creative juices flowing and thinking about, keeping my eye on the ball, making it matter.
MongoDB core value there, making it matter. That's a great answer. Thanks, guys.
Another great place for us to learn about application use cases and our customers is our conferences that we go to. So Prashant and I go to some Python conferences. Last year we went to PyCon. Mike and I went to EuroPy last year, which was great.
That was fun.
And MongoDB World itself is our MongoDB yearly penultimate conference.
I also went to SciPy, where a lot of people from the data analysis community converge. So that's a group of users that we're, I think, now beginning to think about addressing better.
The amazing communities in the Python world. It's just the people are awesome. Well, guys, this has been really phenomenal. I've learned a ton. I always like spending time with you guys. This has been really awesome and informative. Anything else to add? Any shout outs or social media tags? Where can we find you folks?
You can find me on GitHub, I guess. I don't have a Twitter or a social media.
Yeah, find us on GitHub, or if you really want to get under our skin, Jira is the place you want to post on.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you for having us, Mike, Nick.
Yeah,
it's great to be here.
Thanks for spending the time. I know you guys are really busy. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Special thanks to our friends Shane and Prashant for joining us today. We learned so much. Head on over to pymongo.readthedocs.io or motor.readthedocs.io or pymodem.readthedocs.io to learn more about these drivers. Head on over to the community to engage with other Python developers. It's at community.mongodb.com. And hey, we've got a special course just for Python developers. It's called M220P, and that's available at university.mongodb.com. Thanks so much for joining us today. Please, if you wouldn't mind, head on over to your favorite podcast network and leave us a review. Let us know what you liked and maybe what you'd like to hear more of. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.